Hello, fellow searchers of truth-first Christianity in a post-Christian country. Lately, I have begun researching kind of a new area that I want to share with you, and it's based on comments and feedback that I'm getting in sections of several videos. And it's, some of it is critical, like, oh, you're showing only white people in these pictures about the ancient biblical world, and that's not accurate. Some of them are very respectable, saying, hey, you need to look into this more, and others are, we know that BHI has a tendency to be a little more aggressive in their rhetoric, but when you look past that, I have to ask myself as a historian, a theologian and researcher, have I done my due diligence on this subject? And I had to face the harsh reality that I really hadn't. So lately I've been doing a lot of study into this idea of I believe the subject itself is called Afrocentrism. And let me give you a little bit of background. Like in science, you have the scientific method, right? In history, we use what's called the evidentiary method, which is a combination of primary sources written from antiquity, archaeological discoveries, and what later historians had to say about earlier periods of time. And let me tell you the research I've done so far. It runs the gambit, just like all of us, just like all denominations of any ethnicity. We have these kernels of truth that we wrap in all this other artificial scaffolding that is just, for lack of a better term, nonsense. And in Afrocentrism, it seems to run a spectrum. On one side, you have a gentleman named Tariq Nasheed, and with all due respect to him, he's been very successful financially, but what I'm lacking when I listen to him is him saying, hey, here are the sources. Go look at these sources yourself. He makes very outlandish claims about pretty much everything. He's totally in his subjective mind rewritten history, but with no evidence. And when I watch his videos, I find myself asking, Mr. Nasheed, where does this come from? What you're saying, where can I go and read about this? A gentleman named Kevin Adams, I believe, did a documentary on the Nubian pharaohs, right? The Nubians were definitely dark African, Sudanese, Ethiopian, melanin level, and he claimed that their civilization lasted for 5,000 years. So that's something to go on, right? Because he showed archaeological evidence of this Nubian kingdom. That was something I could go on. A gentleman named Akala, who actually gets around to some pretty big universities in Europe, gave a lecture at Oxford or Cambridge. It didn't say in the video, but he provided primary sources where he went back to the books and volumes compiled by editors of the writings of ancient Egypt through Greece, where the people ruling in Egypt at that time were described by the way they looked. And they were definitely African in description. That's something I can go on. I can check those primary sources using the evidentiary method. Dr. Ivan van Sertima, it's a little older. The videos look like they're from the 80s and 90s. But here we have a university professor in academia talking about, hey, there were a lot more African rulers during these times than history has led on. And it made sense to me, I don't believe this idea of Eurocentrism is, purposeful. Take somebody like me who just makes a video. There's an assumption of bad intent on my part to purposely go, ha, 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 everybody's pictures are going to be white and we're going to do away with this idea that, these people were black. But what those people fail to recognize, especially people under the age of 40, like me and many of the commenters, we came to the same schools you did, right? So we read the same textbooks you did. So we were exposed to the same Eurocentrism that you were. We participate in the same beast money system that you do. So if there's this idea of modern oppression, I don't agree that it exists on terms of race between white and black. I think it's more of like poor and regular people versus elites. And I think they fail to recognize that. Another documentary I watched was called From Nothing by Jabari, that had a lot of good information. Information where I could go and check primary sources from what he was talking about. And that's what I need. I can't go by Mr. Nasheed's subjective, out of thin air, higher criticism of these things that give me nothing to go on historically. It's impossible to verify those truth claims. We have to have, and believe me, I'm no friend of academia, but you've got to have something to go on to substantiate and say, okay, I can see where this is true. I can see where this argument is valid. Forgive me, I can't quite read my handwriting here. There was one documentary called The Original Egyptians Were Black. And that one wasn't important because, again, it was another university level professor. But what he did points to one of the big flaws in the Afrocentric movement. He differentiates the Egyptians, original black Egyptians, from the Semitic people, both in pigment and in migration patterns. Well, it can't be both ways. Were the original higher melanin Africans Egyptian, or were they Hebrews? Now, I will say this. There's a theory out there that says the Hebrews were the Hyksos, which was a tribe of Africans, and there was this constant battle, dichotomy, back and forth between northern Egyptian rulers, which by that time had become lighter skinned, at least in those dynasties, and the Hyksos, assuming they were Hebrews, right? But then you come to the point where you say, okay, well, the Hebrews were from Joseph, right? Moses was from Egypt. So there's a lot of unanswered questions with no provenance. Where are the primary sources, right? I have read the volumes of the church fathers. Give me one example where they say, hey, there's this grand conspiracy going on. Why, if this grand conspiracy happened, are we only finding out about it 2,000 years later when we have 30 volumes from the church fathers? We have the Liber Pontificalis, a very old writing from the Catholic Church that openly admits there were 11 popes from Africa. We have other extra-biblical writings all through the Middle Ages, and nobody points to this, this idea that none of them were black, So it's a very modern Eurocentrist idea. Now, finally, the last thing I'm going to say. There's always seems to be the assumption of bad intent on the part of the content creator. First of all, going back to the point that I was indoctrinated in the same schools as any of my black friends were, how would I know otherwise? But you've instead kind of made all whites the scapegoats to say, well, it's your fault. It's your fault that this is happening and that this history has been lost. But you fail to recognize that in the 1450s during the Italian Renaissance, it was the northern Italian papal states that were overwhelmingly white and sent from their families to the papacy for generations. We're talking Borgia, Della Rovere, de Medici, Sforza, these families that kind of traded the papal seat. They were the ones who paid for and commissioned the Christian art that we still look at today. So of course they're going to paint them in their own likenesses. You've got to go further south toward the Mediterranean coast, Sicily, southern Egypt. King Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, he was well known for his ethnic inclusivity. He had Muslims in his court, he had Africans in his court, and during the time of the Crusades, there became a more open exchange of information and trade between North Africa, the Levant, and Southern Europe. So there's all these things that kind of get ignored in this dialogue. So anyway, I have answered the call to study this because my ultimate search is for truth. I don't want to continue to present anything that's inaccurate. And I feel like it's a fair criticism. A lot of the videos I have do kind of paint everybody as, white Old Testament early biblical characters, and that's probably not accurate for all of them, but it's certainly accurate for some. The idea that everybody was African that late in history, No, no, no. Even if you go to the Olmec civilization, where you see signs of, African influence, you also see Polynesian influence and features. So it's possible that you have melting pot ideas there. This idea that Africans were really Native Americans. Well, no, we know they were red-skinned people with features from Asia. That's not to say Africans didn't come across the Atlantic and that there was some interbreeding, which we would expect in cultural exchanges. What it looks like, even in Egypt, is that there were all these kind of four main races. You had really dark skin, caramel skin, red skin, and white skin. And you see that repeat around the cultures of the world. I think that's more accurate. So here's where it makes sense. Africans have been a little bit whitewashed out of history. They're saying, no, this isn't right. And then the remedy runs the extreme, just like we're human beings, and we do that with every subject. You have the real conservative view that says, okay, maybe the Egyptians were, maybe the Hebrews were, they both can't be. Maybe the Olmecs were part African. And then you have the other end of the spectrum. Mozart was black. Beethoven was black. Shakespeare, they were all black. It's all a big conspiracy and all a big lie. But that makes the biggest mistake we can possibly make, which is to assume bad intent on the part of the content creator. I would like to challenge everybody. Do this yourself. Go to Google and type in images of biblical character Judah. How many pages do you have to scroll through to find one that has darker skin? Abraham, how many pages do you have to scroll through to find one that has darker skin? So this goes much bigger than one individual making a video, you know? And I gotta tell you, like when I make my videos, it's not in the forefront of my mind. But one thing I have learned through having another recent video go viral and getting a lot of comments about it is that I admit I probably should be more sensitive to that. And I'm going to do better in the future. But in the meantime, for those who have criticized with those types of criticisms, give me some primary sources that I can go read myself. Not stuff from 1960 from some guy who has a theory based on a science that doesn't exist and he calls himself a doctor, but it's all bullshit. Give me something from ancient antiquity that I can read that says, here's how these people looked. Herodotus, right? He clearly said these people had this thick woolen hair and darker skin like bronze, Okay, well, yeah. All right, Herodotus saw Africans, dark Africans there, right? Now, in closing, I'll say I'm well aware of the Ethiopians and Axum and their claim to the Levitical priesthood, which they probably do have a good claim to that priesthood. For those interested, read Graham Hancock's book on the Ark of the Covenant and the Ethiopians and Axum. Anyway, love you all. Look forward to talking to you on the next video. Thank you so much.